Hello, I'm Joan Retman, Area Community Relations Director for Era Living, and I'll be your speaker for today's event. Before we start today's presentation on evaluating retirement living options, I'd like to share with you a little bit about your official host for today's event, which is the Gardens at Town Square. The Gardens at Town Square is one of 8 premier retirement communities, which are owned and operated by Era Living, a very reputable local company of retirement communities in the Seattle area for the past 30+ years. The Gardens is conveniently located near downtown Bellevue and is just steps away from wonderful amenities like the French Bakery, which is my personal favorite, shops at the Bravern, the Bellevue Public Library, and just minutes from medical centers like Overlake and Kaiser, and also all the great shops at the Bellevue Square, which is just down the street. The Gardens is known for its feeling of independence and vibrancy, its warm hospitality and lovely amenities, which includes one of the most beautiful and brightest dining rooms in the area, plus a very serene and private garden courtyard. The Gardens features a wide variety of newly renovated apartments, which include studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and even a 3-bedroom option. Please check out our website to see some self-guided virtual tours of some of these floor plan styles. And whether you're looking for independent living, assisted living, or memory care services, the Gardens does offer all of those choices. You might appreciate knowing that if you move into the Gardens as an independent living resident, you do not need to move to a different part of the community or to move to a different apartment to receive assisted living services. It comes into the same apartment you moved into. And we're actually going to learn a little bit more about that in today's presentation under the Flex License Model section. So let's go ahead and get started on our presentation, Evaluating Retirement Living Options. I had mentioned to you that in my present role as Area Community Relations Director, I've been in this role and something similar for the past 14 years. During that time frame, my job really has been to help families understand which residential retirement living options were a good fit for them. And I really do feel that it's been an honor for me to serve in this role because I know what an important decision it is, one of the most important decisions that most people make in their lives. And over the years, by working in the variety of different models that I have been working in, I have learned how all of the terminology out there can be really quite confusing sometimes, and that a lot of people I found were making decisions on limited information that they gathered during the touring process, and really that a number of things just aren't always obvious to ask about. You don't know what you don't know, so it's hard to even think of what questions to ask sometimes. So I really wanted to put myself on a mission here to provide education to as many people as I can about how the options are different from one another, and to even share some examples, some lessons learned from meeting with families and speaking with families that will hopefully provide benefit to you to help you be able to make the most informed decision for yourself. So even though I'm wearing, I don't think you can see it in the video, I'll lift up my name tag here. I am wearing an Era Living name badge today, but please understand that for the purpose of this presentation, I'm really here as a broader resource and a guide for you as we get into exploring the pros and cons of the options and even look at some of the lesser explored considerations. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So the first slide is really a summary of what we are going to cover today. We're going to talk about the different types of senior living models that are out there. We're going to talk about the financial contracts that are attached to those, pros and cons of each one, important considerations for making sure you have an informed decision. And then, of course, some of the biggest questions out there is, how do I really know it's the right place for me, or how do I know it's the best time? So we're going to get into that today. The 4 areas that we're going to focus on with the different senior living models out there are retirement community, Ccrc, flex license, and assisted living, those 4 things on the top part of this slide. There is much more that we could talk about, but it would be a 2 to 3 hour presentation if we covered in detail every single one of these things. So the options listed at the bottom can be saved for perhaps a follow-up conversation if you have questions specific to those. But we're going to get started just by focusing on the 4 things at the top. So let's move into retirement community. So for this particular slide, when I'm speaking of retirement community here, this is really a very general term, retirement community. It's not really saying anything more than that. Retirement community covers everything, whether care is involved or not. So really what a retirement community is then, just by that definition alone, is that there are age restrictions to it. And all communities have some sort of age restrictions in place. They might make exceptions from time to time, but they generally are 55 and older, 62 or older, or 65 and older. Many of these communities also have shared services available, activities available, community centers, those types of things. So we're going to break it down a little bit and go through the different types of communities that are out there, whether care is included or not. So first, let's start with the type of retirement community that is not related to care. So we're going to look at the pros and cons of a 55 and plus retirement community. So these are the type of communities that don't have care involved. These are communities like you might have heard of Providence Point or Trilogy, for instance, or Revel is a new community in Issaquah, where the goal here is to create an environment where there are activities that are designed to meet the needs and interests of those who are within a certain age category, 55 and plus. It makes it very easy to participate in these activities when you're all living in close physical proximity to them. And oftentimes from the perspective of an adult child, they love this if their parents are taking this first step, because it gives them peace of mind that you're maybe not burdened with all of the additional responsibilities of home ownership that you might have had before the move. Looking at disadvantages to a design like this is that they're not even just specifically to the 55 and older type of designs, but really for all retirement communities in general. Sometimes when I meet with prospective residents or their families, they're a little worried that there might be limited access to younger generations. And they're concerned that they will not have exposure to youth, and that concerns them sometimes. So my advice, whether it's looking at a community that's designed like this or others that we're about to talk about, is if that's something that's really important to you, express that concern when you're meeting with someone from the community, like myself, a community relations team member, marketing person. We have different titles, but there might be opportunities where there are a lot of programs in place where there are partnerships with local churches and local schools, where there are youth groups that come in and use the spaces, either working directly with residents for programs or even just using the space, like Girl Scouts coming in and hosting meetings. Of course, sometimes that's different while there are COVID restrictions in place, but if and when we get on the other side of this, those opportunities, if they have been placed on pause, they will come back again. So be sure to ask about that if that is important to you. Another disadvantage might be that if you do choose an environment like this that doesn't have care in place as an option to add on in the future, that can be a little stressful sometimes if you do need to make a move again, because there are care needs that pop up. Depending on how urgent or severe the care needs might be, sometimes that can be difficult when making a move when you're in that type of situation. So if you have a crystal ball out there, maybe dust it off and see what your future holds, because it's always nice to try to make a move before a crisis happens. So if you can time that right, that's pretty amazing. It can be difficult, but that's ideal, is to try to get ahead of any health concerns that might happen. And so if you do have a health condition that is a pressing one for the move, sometimes it can be difficult then if you've moved into a type of community which was a buy-in as opposed to a month-to-month model, because you might be relying upon those funds that you had paid to pay for your care. And then if you're waiting to sell that before making the move, it can sometimes cause a few hiccups. So the bottom of this slide also is a reminder of a few of the communities I just mentioned earlier that fall under the 55 and older model. Many of them have been around for quite a number of years. Providence Point and Trilogy we just talked about. Shag is another one that you'll find communities all over the place, east side and west side. A lot of communities that have been around for a while, and new ones that are being developed too. So now we're going to move on to CCRCs, or Continuing Care Retirement Communities. This one's going to take a little bit more explanation to go through because there are different types of CCRCs to talk about. And one of the first things that I'm going to mention is that you might have noticed the label on this slide. It says Life Plan, or CCRC. And Life Plan is, I want to say, a relatively new term that is now being used. Life Plan used to be referred to as Life Care. And so talk about confusing terminology, the terms have changed throughout the years. So the goal here is for us to talk a little bit about what each of these models mean, so that even if the terminology continues to change, you'll know what questions to ask to really be able to identify exactly what model that you might be talking about. So with a continuing care retirement community model, these are ones that are usually 62 and older or 65 and older. These include various levels of care, like independent living, assisted living, skilled nursing, and memory care. All of these care levels, to be a true CCRC, they exist there. And they're generally designed to be segregated from one another. So the concept here is that you move into an independent living apartment or house, depending on the design of it. And then at some point in the future, as your care needs change, you would then move out of the original location that you moved into and then move into their assisted living section or skilled nursing section or memory care section. The Ccrc concept is really meant to be very well-rounded with a number of other things that are now included in the rent. A full maintenance program, a housekeeping schedule, usually once per week or twice per week, depending on the community. Usually that's included in the rent as well as the maintenance. There's some sort of dining program now that would be included in the rent when looking at CCRCs. Sometimes it's on a credit system, sometimes it's on number of meals per day. So more questions to be asked there, but there's almost always some sort of dining plan included. Transportation is now available. For some communities, they do it with a fee. For other community, it might be included within a certain radius, but it's available. And then the activities are usually kicked up a notch from what you typically find in 55 and older. So there's usually a plethora of opportunities that are available. Many of them are quite accessible, that are tied very closely to the residential areas within a CCRC, so very easy access to those. And then again, the goal is that if you do have a health change and you need to move from your independent living apartment to another part of the community, you do have priority access to this, meaning that if the community is large enough where they occasionally have room for people who don't live in the independent living to move into assisted living, people from the outside that haven't made a move here yet, they do have availability depending on the community. But if the timing should happen to work out that there's a need for someone from the outside at the same time as someone from the inside, so to speak, who's living in independent living, the person who is living in the independent living would have access to that care. But some communities are not designed that way. Some communities do not have the number of beds, if you will, in skilled nursing or apartments in assisted living to be able to provide options for folks from the outside. So those are considered closed to the public. They only offer apartments to their independent residents who move through the continuum of care. The other key identifier for a CCRC is that these are what are known as buy-in or entrance fee communities. You're going to hear the term community fee or initiation fee in a few minutes. In the industry, they're thought of as two different things. Even though the concept is the same, there's some degree of a upfront payment that you make before you move in. When we talk about buy-in or an entrance fee, that's really more so of the equivalent of if you were purchasing a house or a condo. So for many CCRCs, it could be, $200,000, $300,000, $800,000, $1 million or more. You don't pay all of that and it goes away though. Most of these contracts have a refundable component to it. Very commonly, it might be around 80%. Some of them you maybe pay a little bit smaller of a buy-in, but then you get half of it back instead. Amortized contracts, they're still floating around out there too, where you pay an even smaller amount, but then it goes away over time. So after you've lived in the community, let's say for 5 years or so, all of the entrance fee is absorbed into the community at that point in time. So now we're going to dig a little bit deeper, and we're going to talk about 3 different types of CCRCs. So we're going to be very specific now. We're going to go into types A, B, and C. So we're going to talk about type A first, which means specifically life care. So right now, life care is referring only to a type A community. And a type A community is, you might recognize some of these names, especially over here on the east side. Emerald Heights has been around for many, many years, 30 plus years, I think, in Redmond. Timber Ridge at Tallis is what that next abbreviation is for. I would say that's a new-ish community, 10 plus years old now, I want to say, in Issaquah. And then there's Skyline, which opened around the same time in First Hill in Seattle. So a life care or a type A contract is the most comprehensive in the sense of what happens financially when you move in. So you start out independent, and then here, when you move through the continuum of care, it doesn't matter whether you move to assisted living permanently or memory care permanently, or even if you have a very acute need that leads you to skilled nursing permanently. The concept here is that whatever you had been paying as your independent living monthly fee follows you through the continuum of care. So let's say that you pay $3,000 or $4,000 per month for an independent living apartment. If you move to assisted living, that follows. Or if you move to skilled nursing, that follows. There are some various factors in this. So not all 3 of these communities here operate in the exact same way, but that concept applies. So if you transfer over and there is an increase in your charge, it's going to be fairly minimal. In all circumstances, it will definitely be much less than what the going rate might be. So if we were meeting in person right now, I would ask to get some feedback from the group on if you have any sense of what the going rate is or the market rate is for skilled nursing these days, for instance. And it's a little hard to do that over the webinar, so I won't try to ask the group, but if you were to answer that question, for those who are spot on, it's usually at least $12,000 to $15,000 a month these days for the market rate for skilled nursing, so it's quite expensive. So a plan like this could help save a lot of money should you happen to have care needs in the future. Now keep in mind though, with a contract like this, there are pre-existing conditions that could disqualify you from this benefit. So this is where that crystal ball comes in handy again, because you'll want to try to move into a community like this before there are some big disqualifiers, like if you have mild cognitive impairment or a more severe diagnosis as it relates to dementia, or many times Parkinson's or movement disorders like that, that make it so likely that you're going to need care in the future, that would disqualify you very likely from receiving that type of a financial benefit. Now, the community may or may not still allow you to move in, even while you're independent. They may still allow you to move in, but from the financial piece, you may not get that benefit. So a lot of people ask, well, is this like a long-term care insurance policy? And the answer is truly yes. It's really as good as any possible policy that you could buy, essentially, in the sense that if you qualify, once you're living independently, and you move through that continuum of care, you're protected from market rate for the duration of time that you live there. And they don't write long-term care policies like that anymore. They actually used to at one point have unlimited benefits, but not anymore. They don't write policies quite like that. So that's a type A. Now we're going to talk briefly about a type B, which is also called a modified contract. And these contracts are, they're really a lot like a type A in the sense that you have all of this full continuum of care before you if you need it, but the financial benefits are a little different. So you start out independent just the same, but then if you move through the continuum of care, there are some limits. Those limits can vary wildly from one community to the next. I have two examples here written on this slide for communities, but there are others around, I'm sure. So an example might be if you lived in assisted living, maybe for the first 2 months, you might have a price break, and then it jumps to market rate after that. Or you might have some free days in skilled nursing that you can use for a while, and then assuming it's a permanent situation, it may jump to market rate after that. So these are a little harder to understand, I would say, the contract. So it's always really good to read through the contract in detail ahead of time so you can identify where you receive the benefits and when they expire and what that looks like. So you want to look at that for every care level that is noted for the type B. And then finally, a type C contract, which is a fee-for-service contract, is probably the most common type of CCRC that is around here. The type A contracts, if you go to the East Coast, that's where this concept originated. They're all over the place there. So relatively newish, I guess I would say, comparatively. But the type C contracts are very common around here. There are a couple of examples listed, Bayview Manor, Hearthstone, but there are many others. And these contracts, they're pretty black and white. You would just simply move from independent living to the appropriate level of care, but you're paying market rate. There aren't discounts. You still have priority over anybody else from the outside, but you would pay market rate here. You might ask, well, why would I choose one of those compared to one of the others? And usually the answer is that the buy-ins are usually smaller for those. So you pay a very large buy-in typically for the life care ones or even the modified ones, but there's a greater benefit if you need care. So it's kind of like buying insurance in a way, and that's where the benefit comes in. So type Cs are going to have smaller entrance fees. So now let's dig even a little bit deeper and look more closely at pros and cons of the CCRC lifestyle as a whole. So this is wrapping in really all of the kinds together in a sense. So of course, some of the benefits are very obvious that, you know, who doesn't love the idea of knowing that, gosh, if I need any level of care, it's here, it's within the community. That would give me great peace of mind, feeling that I've got everything covered and having priority access to that. That, of course, feels really good. The financial benefits that go along with it. Even if you have a long-term care insurance policy, you can use it together so that almost completely eliminates your fees in some cases. That's really nice. Many of the continuing care retirement communities also have a benevolent fund, which means that if you exhaust your resources at some point in the future, the community's got you covered. And there are some people that when they hear this, they worry and they think, well, that doesn't sound like that would be viable financially to offer that. How does the community stay afloat if they're funding the expenses of the residents that live there? But please know that from my experience, this is not something to worry about. It really is a nice benefit because you do have to financially qualify before you move into a CCRC. So you have to show with financial statements and such that you are covered, that you can pay for the entrance fee or the buy-in and have plenty for years to come. Plus, remember, most of those are refundable. So worst case scenario, you can tap into that refundable portion too. and know that it's extremely rare that somebody does exhaust their resources. There is language in the contract that does say, now don't go and gift all your money away once you sign up here. So you do have to keep that in mind as part of moving in, that you have to be good stewards, of course, of your funds. And you can always talk through this more with a financial advisor if you have other questions about it, but it is a nice benefit I thought I'd mention on here. The other difference that I will mention, just generally speaking, between the Ccrc concept with that buy-in and ones that don't have that big buy-in, is that when you pay that large amount upfront, that also usually means that your monthly fees, because you do still have monthly fees that you need to pay even though you paid that upfront expense, they're usually smaller. They can be considerably smaller, actually, than a month-to-month contract that might charge a very small amount going in. So some disadvantages. I'm gonna go through most of these here. So one of the things that became really apparent to me, I'll start out by sharing a little story. So I started in the industry about 14 years, and my first role in this industry was working inside of a Ccrc. It was a brand new one that was getting ready to open in about a year. So a lot of people were signing up. They were reserving apartments in advance. Very, very exciting time. And so I continued at this community while it opened and for many years beyond it. So fast forward 5 years later, you can imagine that many people who had started out independent, that changed for some folks. And in the cases of couples in particular, didn't change the same way. So some of them remained, one person of a couple remained independent, the other person maybe started to need a significant amount of care. Now remember, with this model, the Ccrc model, the idea is that if you need care, you need to move to where the care is in the building. That was hard for a lot of couples to now think about, oh, it might be time then for us to start residing in two different spaces, because one person needed care, one person did not. So interestingly, a lesson learned that surprised me is that what some of these residents chose to do, instead of, say, splitting up as a couple for residential purposes, they brought in home care. So they paid market rate for home care rather than receiving a life care benefit or a discounted rate for the sake of staying together longer as a couple. That was interesting to me, and that happened actually fairly often. Another thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about, although this is a smaller concern, I think it's just good to be aware of that even though you move in independently, and let's say that you qualify, so there aren't any alarming pre-existing conditions that the community is concerned about. So they say, sure, go ahead and move in and you'll get the life care benefit in the future. There's one thing to be aware of, that they still can't guarantee 100% that you can move into that higher level of care, because there still is a medical assessment that would be required at the time that your health changes, where the nurse of the community has to ensure that the arrangements that they have there, that their care capabilities can meet your needs. And even though it's rare that Ccrc cannot meet the needs with all of those care levels that are there, I did see it happen one time where a couple had moved into the Ccrc that I'm referring to, and the husband of the couple started to develop dementia, which had some additional challenges beyond what would normally be in place, with some aggressive behaviors and exit seeking and such. He was a very fit, very strong, physically very strong person, so it would require a special environment for him to be safe enough. So this community had to unfortunately say to this couple that your husband wouldn't be an appropriate fit for our memory care. And so even though they had this plan in place with the life care benefit, the husband did move to a different environment into their memory care specifically that was designed for managing some higher level challenges. That was concerning, obviously, to that family for a number of reasons. Again, it's rare. I don't want to scare you, but I just want you to know a little bit more how the communities work and that you still have to go through a medical assessment. The other piece that was a little hard for some folks who made the transition from independent living to a higher level of care is that they then moved from that lifestyle to a new one. So depending on how the CCRCs are designed, their, say, assisted living and whatnot, that is in a different place, but oftentimes so is the dining room, so are the activities, the staffing might be different. So in some ways, it felt a little foreign to them that they were moving into really an entirely new environment, although owned by the same group or operated by the same group. This one goes without saying when making choices about what model is right for you when you're looking at buy-ins. There are some folks that say they're not interested in the buy-in so much because they then can't use their funds to invest in a way that they would choose. These funds, how they typically work, are invested by the retirement community, by the CCRC, for their benefit, to be able to keep the monthly fees a little bit lower and to be able to offer benefits like the reduced rates for care that I mentioned earlier. But they can do that because they do have those funds to invest. So they're not immediately available to you should you happen to move out. Normally what would happen is if you do decide, I need to move to Florida instead or wherever it might be, the entrance fee that you've paid, let's say it's 80% that comes back to you, that will come back to you after the new family moves into it. They've paid their entrance fee, so a portion of that is what would then come back to you at that point. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the downside might be that you might have pre-existing conditions that could disqualify admission for this model. Now we're going to switch to a flex license model. I touched on that just a tiny bit during the introduction. A flex license model is different than a continuing care retirement community model, where the whole entire building or a whole section of the building could be an independent living apartment or it could be an assisted living apartment. It could be one. It could start out as one and then move to the other. So there are a designated number of apartments that can be licensed for assisted living at a given time. So let's say you have a community that has 150 apartments. Maybe they have licenses for 50 apartments to be licensed as assisted living at a given time. That number is completely subjective. It is whatever that company or community has decided they want to strive for in terms of their ratio between independent living and assisted living. I won't go into more detail on that piece of it now, but just for you to kind of get the gist of it. So the concept here is, since independent living is part of it, most communities do prefer that you move in while you're independent, although it's not always a requirement. But if something then changes in the future, you stay right there in that same apartment, and then you add assisted living services like medication management, dressing, showering assistance. You stay right there. You don't move for care. These types of models are usually a month-to-month concept with a community fee. I mentioned community fee a little bit earlier. So in terms of numbers, instead of hundreds of thousands, a community fee might be closer to maybe equal to 1 month's rent or maybe 2 months' rent. There are some variations on that around the area. Sometimes it's even a little bit less than that, but you might be talking 5,000, 10,000 or something in that neighborhood instead of hundreds of thousands. So it's a little bit different. And as I alluded, many communities do like you to be independent. If not, they look for people to be on the light side of assisted living services at the time of the move-in, and then that protects really the vibrancy and the model of the community that way. So you normally see a higher percentage of independent residents than assisted living residents in these models. With the examples given at the bottom of this page, Era Living communities, Merrill Gardens, leisure care communities, all of these kind of operate with, just very generally speaking, kind of a similar formula, which if you're curious, it's usually about 70% of the residents are independent and about 30% of the residents are using assisted living services at a given time. And that fluctuates, of course. I'll also just mention really quickly, this is kind of a fun fact that I learned after I started working for Era Living, is that This flex license model, this design, was actually created by Era Living decades ago, in part because of the relationship with the University of Washington and the University of Washington Retirement Association, where they were exploring what ideal model would seniors really like. And the feedback that they received is, we would really love to not have to move again if we don't have to. And so they created a different type of model than the Ccrc concept for those who feel this would be a better fit. I'm happy to share more about that later too. So let's talk a little bit about what might then be some advantages or disadvantages. Of course, like we just talked about, a lot of people like the idea of not having to move when assisted living services are needed. For obvious reasons, couples love that. There's not the stress of having to make the decision of, gosh, should we separate in order to receive care, hire in home care? What does that look like? You can just provide services for the person who needs it. So this creates also a very inclusive type of culture where you don't have a separate dining room, separate activities. You just keep doing what you've always been doing. And when you live in an environment like this, you don't even necessarily know which residents are using assisted living services and which ones aren't, because you're all going and doing the same things that you always used to. The lower upfront cost, again, can be very appealing. Disadvantages would be that the monthly rents are usually higher than a buy-in, like we talked about before. And because these types of models are not a CCRC, that means that there might be some care levels missing. So a very common flex license model is independent and assisted living, those two care levels. Some of them, like the Gardens at Town Square, also has memory care, but not skilled nursing. So depending on what's important to you, maybe what pre-existing conditions you have, it might be important to explore that and understand what care levels are available, to what degree of care can be offered, and what happens if at some point your care needs grow outside what the community can offer there. Talking a little bit about assisted living more specifically. So we've been talking a lot about that and how it's available in different combinations. It's certainly part of a continuing care retirement community. In flex licenses, it's paired with independent living. Memory care, as I mentioned, can be layered into it too, or sometimes it's all by itself. So it can really come in any way, shape, or form for a community. The definition of activity of daily living is spelled out there on the slide. So those are things like grooming, dressing, bathing, and such. This is personal care. In the industry, the term is activities of daily living. And if you have a long-term care insurance policy, you'll see language in there too that usually says for you to utilize that policy, you generally need assistance in 2 or more of the activities of daily living before your coverage will kick in. We could do a webinar entirely on long-term care insurance. There's all kinds of variables to look at there too. Now, nursing. So sometimes people assume that nurses are the ones that do all of the work, that provide all of the care. And just to kind of clarify the terminology, a nurse, either a registered nurse or an LPN, that's a skill set that's at a little bit of a higher level. So oftentimes they do more of the administrative roles, the oversight, they do assessments, but they delegate most of the caregiving responsibilities to nursing assistants or CNAs. So it's traditionally a nursing assistant that does all of the ADAs that are listed there on this slide. Nurses provide the oversight. So they're not necessarily needed 24 hours a day inside the community, but CNAs certainly are. So you'll usually see CNAs 24/7, and nursing hours for most assisted living communities can vary somewhere between 8 and 16 hours a day. There are some assisted living communities that operate at a very high level of assisted living, because there are variables there too. And they might be 24 hours a day, but that's the exception, not the rule. There are fewer communities that have actual nurses in the building that often. It's usually 12-ish hours for most. And I guess a couple other things I'll just mention quickly on here, that when you're looking at some of the communities noted at the bottom here, like Sunrise, Aegis, Patriots Glen, those are actually communities that are licensed fully for assisted living. They don't operate from a flex license. 100% of their apartments are already pre-licensed from assisted living, with assisted living from the very beginning. And that's kind of their target audience, so to speak. So it's not that if you're independent, you can't move there. Actually, many times couples do, where one person needs a fair amount of care and the other doesn't. But they're all in for assisted living. So their model looks a little bit different than some other environments that offer assisted living. Assisted living falls under, it's called the boarding home license with the state of Washington. And that can mean you can provide heavy or light assisted living all the way up to 2-person transfers and Hoyer lift if you want to. But it's up to the community to decide within that range, where do they want to fall with their services. So communities that function where they're focusing entirely on assisted living tend to have people that move in typically a little bit later. So when they have higher assisted living needs or very heavy assisted living needs, they usually run towards the end of that full range of services that are offered. Now I want to spend a few minutes talking about what I think is my favorite part of this webinar, which is to talk a little bit about some of the most overlooked considerations out there. And I picked kind of my top 10, but you might have some of your own that come to mind too from your own experiences. But I want to talk about this first one for sure. So number one is pre-existing conditions and admission criteria. I put this one on here because time and time again, a lot of folks come in and they will say after touring the community that they're not feeling ready and that they want to wait until they can't take care of themselves anymore, or until somebody has to carry me out of my house. I hear that a fair amount too. So it's important then to understand that that might be a perfectly good plan to move into certain communities, but not all of them, because many communities, especially ones that have an independent living component, they do have admission criteria. So that means that you either need to be independent or you need to fall within a certain window to move in. And once you do that, then many of them have quite high levels of care available after that, but you have to time it right. To get that crystal ball out again, you have to time it right and move in before you have exceeded that admission criteria. So again, admission criteria can be different than what the total care capabilities are. It just relates to the model in order to protect a type of model that has a more independent or vibrant focus. So if you have other questions about that, I'm happy to answer those maybe after the webinar. If you have maybe specific examples where you're wondering about how that might work for timing for moving into certain communities, I'm happy to go into more detail then. Number two, local owners and managers. So this actually was something that stood out to me in more recent years. There's a lot of changes that have happened in the Seattle area, both east side and west side lately. Lots of changes with new communities popping up all over the place, and also some changes with existing ones too, where the owners and the managers might be different from one another. So one of the things that I have come to notice from my personal observations is that those that are one and the same, that are both the management company and the owner of the community, seems like there's more stability there in some of the cases that you might tend to, especially if they've been there for a while, 10 years, 20 years, like Era Living communities. Era Living's been around 30 years. That comes to mind as an example. Being the same, owning and managing, means that you're more likely to be on the same page. You're less likely to have staff turnover, or in some cases, I have seen some communities where the management company has changed a couple times. I don't know the reasons why, but we start to get some phone calls sometimes from other communities where residents are saying that they feel like the services have changed, that the staff has turned over. Some residents that have lived there for a number of years say it's different than how it always used to be. There is more likely to be something concerning there. So my advice would be this: if you are looking at communities, ask the question, are you just the management company, or do you own it too? And if the answer is two different answers, don't worry about that yet. Just ask more questions and say, how long has this management company been in place? How long has the management company before that one been in place? And if you're starting to hear that it's turned over a little bit, maybe 2 or more times, then before making any decisions, I would for sure want to talk to a variety of different residents that live there over different lengths of time to get an understanding of what did that look like. Sometimes new management could be a really great thing. So it just means asking more questions to make sure that you're seeing that stability. So you know that you're not going to move in, then suddenly there'll be another new management company a year from now, and then the expectations might fall short for you. The for-profit and not-for-profit point here is just a simple one. When you go onto the internet, you can find a variety of different checklists all over the place on when you tour a retirement community, be sure to ask these questions. But they don't really provide a lot of information beyond that. So how do you know if it's a good answer or a bad answer? And one of the things that I see on some of these checklists is to ask if it's a for-profit and a not-for-profit. I don't think it means that much. I think probably better questions to ask might be, what do annual increases typically look like, to get a sense of what the budget might be required for you to move into that community. But in terms of for-profit or not-for-profit, that's not really going to tell you if a community is good or bad. For me, considering options for my own parents who live in Minnesota, in their case, home care is in place right now because they're in a very rural area on a farm, and there aren't other options to choose from right now. But when I was interviewing home care companies for my mom, I didn't pick one because I felt like it was a not-for-profit or it was the least expensive necessarily. I wanted to find the one that I felt offered good value, maybe not the most expensive, but that the services would be solid, and that the community was, or that the company was reputable. So those are more important factors, I feel, than looking at this specific terminology here. State surveys. If you are not aware, the Department of Social and Health Services needs to do inspections of retirement communities every 12 to 18 months. Now, during COVID, that's thrown a wrench in a little bit of that, and they haven't been keeping the schedules that they used to. But what happens during a survey is they come in and they take a very thorough look at the assisted living, the licensed side of the community, to make sure they're doing everything that they should be. Everything from checking the correct water temperatures to the condition of the building to looking at the records, the documentation to make sure there aren't mistakes with medication and everything else. So each community that's licensed for assisted living has to keep a copy of the most recent report, and that needs to be available for anybody who wants to ask for it, so you can get a copy of it. And once you do, when you read through it, if you see certain things on there that you have questions about, I would ask to speak then with the executive director, who can walk you through anything that might have come up on there and how it might have been resolved to see if there are any other questions that you should be asking about it. There are some things that pop up on state surveys that maybe sound scary, but they're really not. Like you can be a retirement community and get a ding on your record if you have a chip in your drywall that doesn't have paint on it that's stealing the drywall dust in. I might not be as concerned about that than if I see something that says stop placement, which usually means the community is doing something pretty off point in order to receive that kind of a notification. So stop placement ones, that would make me a little nervous. I would definitely want the executive director to explain how they can assure that that's not something to expect when you move in. But putting paint on drywall, maybe not so much to worry about. With staff ratios and longevity, the only thing that I wanted to mention here is that, with staff members, sometimes you see turnover for right reasons, and then there can be turnover for the wrong reasons. And there are communities out there that have really wonderful partnerships with, like, the School of Nursing through the University of Washington or other places where they have this wonderful relationship where it pulls in a lot of, say, nursing students who might start out as nursing assistants, CNAs, and grow through their career. We just had a couple of staff members here at the Gardens at Town Square, for instance, that are moving on because they made it into pre-med. So we're excited for them. That's something to celebrate. But unfortunately, they won't be continuing to work here anymore. They need to move on and go to school. But by having those quality of team members here, we can feel really good about that and pull in new folks to replace them as needed. With the staff to resident ratios, that's hard to know when you're just receiving a number from a community, just by the number, if that's good or bad or otherwise. You would have to know a lot more about the model of the community before you can make any determination on that or not. For instance, a 1 to 6 staff to resident ratio is pretty great for a memory care environment, but you don't need that for independent living because you're not needing the care. So it would be overstaffed in one situation, maybe staffed perfectly in another. So when you hear those numbers, it's good then to ask more questions about what the needs are for the residents and approximately what percentage of the population of residents need that kind of care before you can take more guesses at what that means. Age of community or company, what is the reputation? So there are a lot of communities, as I mentioned, that are coming online now that are new in terms of their development. If they're brand new, you know, I'll say this from being someone who's actually opened a number of brand new communities. It's fun and it's exciting. It's really great to look at brand new communities, but they can come with their problems too. And it's funny how you can have something planned a certain way or designed a certain way, but then when you're up and running and you have water running through the pipes and everything else, that there are some surprises in there. And sometimes there need to be some adjustments made along the way. But if it's a new community that's being operated by a company that's been around for a while, they'll know what to do, how to work through the kinks. And so that's not necessarily something that's concerning. But if you want the most assurance and you want the strongest track record to move into a community that's really predictable with services and such, then sometimes focusing on some of the more established communities, even if they're not rich with the latest and greatest of every new amenity, might be a better fit for you. So it depends on what's important for you in that respect. And then for some of these communities, like flex license ones, sometimes there's more flexibility in how care might be provided to a loved one. So for instance, there are some families, like adult children, who do a great job helping set up pillboxes for their parent. And once that's in place, their parent can continue to live independently in a community, and they do just great. For others, they need more hands-on. Now, depending on the way a community is licensed, some communities might have different rules around that if they allow it or not. Some might say that if the person who's moving in can't manage 100% of their medications in every way, shape, or form, then the community will take over that piece. More from a liability standpoint, I think, is why they want to focus on that. Where others might say, well, as long as we can all agree that this is a safe practice and the family can demonstrate that it works safely and works well, there might be some flexibility in those models, which is usually in the flex model. Ease of terminating contract if your situation changes. This is simply comparing if you're in a buy-in versus a month-to-month. If you are in a buy-in type of model, then it's a little bit harder if something changes in the future for you to move, because again, you have to typically wait for the resale of your apartment to get your funds back. In a month-to-month contract, it's very simple. Essentially, you give 1 month's notice. But the last point on here, the moving more than once one. So I wanted to talk about that for just a minute, because if you are looking at a community, a CCRC, simply from the standpoint that if something changes in the future, I want to make sure that the care is available for me. But maybe you're comparing it to a community that doesn't have skilled nursing and it doesn't have memory care, but maybe you're really independent. Maybe you don't have a family history of dementia. Maybe you don't have any concerns about memory loss right now. You're really independent. You've been there a few times. You've had meals. You love the staff. The programs are meaningful for you. You have great conversations with staff and residents. Everything feels right, but you might choose a CCRC simply because it may have skilled nursing or memory care, which you may not need in the future. The piece that I wanted to point out again is that remember with the CCRC, you have to move anyway. You will have to move from your independent apartment at some point to receive the care that's offered there. And again, it can feel foreign, like I mentioned. It can feel like moving to a different environment anyway. Now, the other contract, the month-to-month one, they may not have skilled nursing on site, but find out what they do though, if somebody does need long-term care. Maybe there's a wonderful partner that's just a block away that might be very easy to move to. And then you can have this amazing quality of life this whole time. And then if you need higher care in the future, it's just a move not that far away. So I just encourage that if you are looking for those reasons, just explore a little bit further before you make that final decision. And of course, when you are looking at a CCRC, also then be sure to take a look at the higher care levels and where they are. Because the other thing that was interesting, going back to my first story that I shared with you about couples or people not wanting to move through the continuum, is that the apartments were so different on the assisted living side. That was part of the objection too, is I don't want to give up my beautiful 1,400 square foot apartment with this lovely view to move down into a 600 square foot apartment that doesn't have a view because now I need medication management and showering assistance. So tour the whole community if you're looking at a CCRC to make sure it feels good. That's my point on that. That's enough on that. Let's move on to the last couple slides here. This one, I'm not going to speak about very much. These are other things to consider. Some of them we've touched on already, like long-term care insurance, to factor that into the financial part of your decision. If you need Medicaid, those are harder to find. You can ask me questions another time. I can share a little bit more about Medicaid options, but the one thing I wanted you to know is that if it looks like you'll need Medicaid in the near future, many of them do have a spend down requirement, many communities where you pay privately for a year or two or more, and then you can be eligible. We talked about annual rent increases already. Also, just to know, there are other industry professionals that sometimes visit retirement communities that may or may not be important to you to have a podiatrist that comes on site. But if it is, ask about that and other services that might come right directly to the community, which could make your life a lot easier. I put incentives on here, so just to touch on that quickly. Incentives have popped up like crazy for a lot of retirement communities during COVID, because this was our first pandemic for everybody, for all retirement communities, and no one really knew exactly what was going to happen a couple years ago when all this began. And now here we are moving into our third year. Who would have known this would happen? Now, some communities, it felt to me, this is my personal opinion though, it felt like there were some knee-jerk reactions and a little bit of panic and, oh gosh, our occupancy numbers are going down, so let's start giving away rent like crazy or deals all over the place. I worry about that. So I just want to just throw it out there as a word of caution. Even though a lot of incentives sound good, if they sound like they're almost too good to be true or are really extensive, perhaps they might be. It may not be something you might feel right away, but sometimes when communities go a little overboard, think about it. They have budgets that they need to hit too. And if there's a lot of free rent and deals out there, how are they really able to hit those budgets and then honor the services that were promised to residents who've moved in? There's risk of that. So just proceed with caution if you're still hearing that out there. I think most communities have stabilized for the most part. A few giveaways here and there are not concerning, but just look for some more major things that I've seen out there. Now let's talk really quickly. We're pretty close to the end of our time here. We're at 3 o'clock, but there's just a couple more slides. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. Again, if you want a copy of this presentation, this will definitely be available for you. We can email this out to you if you'd like. So just real quick, let's talk about a couple of these points here about how to understand if a community is the right fit for you personally. And the best advice that I can recommend here is to please just try to have a realistic understanding of your own situation. That if maybe you had been a marathon runner at one point in your life, and maybe that's not the case now, and you start to need some support, be sure to look for a community that can offer that support, focusing on ones that are strictly independent living, that don't have the care options for you. It might feel good initially, and it might feel like, well, I'm striving to be independent, so that's the right fit for me. But in the end, chances are that it might mean you might have to move again if you already need care services or on the verge of it. So sometimes it means having a heart-to-heart with ourselves to talk a little bit about how we might not be what we used to be, but that can help us be in a type of environment then that can help you be as independent as you possibly can, maybe even create more independence than you currently have if you need services already, and can keep you independent longer. Look at more than the average age of residents. Please do this. Focus more on the vibrancy and the cognition of the residents there to see how that might be a match for you. There are so many people that tour and say, what's the average age of your residents here? And I promise you that doesn't mean as much as if you are someone who's still really cognizant, you don't have memory issues yet, and it's really important to you have great conversations. It's not going to be as important to move into a community that has predominantly 70-year-olds versus 90-year-olds as it is having many others around you who can also share in that same experience. Because retirement communities, again, that age range is quite wide. So there are a lot of communities that specialize more so in memory loss and might have the majority of the population in their 70s there, but would really struggle with those kinds of conversations versus others that have more of an independent focus. So hopefully that makes sense. Attend activities. Do this. Attend activities or observe them. During COVID, it can be hard to participate because of restrictions, but you can still observe them. You can still meet residents in different ways. You can still try meals. You can still do guest stays in certain apartments if available. So even though there are restrictions in place, there is a plethora of ways that you can still learn about the community in ways that are meaningful for you and gain exposure. Visit the community multiple times. It's not necessarily just a one visit type of thing in order to learn about the details of the community. In fact, it's better to visit the community at different times of day or different shifts to meet different residents and staff members, and then you get a more well-rounded picture. Ask about care limitations, especially if you do have some sort of a health condition that looks like you're going to need care at some point. Know what the limits are and then what the plan might be. It doesn't necessarily mean that's not the right community for you. It just might mean you might have to plan for a first move and then have a plan B in case your care needs grow at some point in the future. And how to understand if it's the right time. This goes back to having a heart-to-heart with yourself and really understanding, what is your life looking like right now? Even just processing, how has it changed in the past 5 years? And if it's related to a health condition, what you might imagine that to look like in the next 5 years. I know that's hard without the crystal ball, but sometimes having conversations with your doctor can be helpful in that sense. Looking at your house or your current home, how are you doing in that space? Is it a space that's just really familiar to you and you're comfortable in it, so why move? Is it that kind of a thought process? Or are you really maximizing living in that space? Are you able to engage with other people, have your social needs met, have fitness opportunities that are important to you if it is? So are you surviving or really just kind of getting by because that's what you have been in the routine of? And might that be different if you were to make a move? It's something to think about. What your diet might be like, processed foods, microwavable foods versus chef-prepared healthy meals. Would that make a difference in your life? This one's a big one, though. Are you currently a caregiver for a spouse or a partner? and might be feeling like that might be becoming your whole identity versus more so just the spousal role, and what it might look like to share some of those caregiving responsibilities with staff in a community. Have you had any falls recently or any health scares within the past year? That might be an indicator. Definitely if you are diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, that's one that I would say don't wait. It's a good time to think about moving, because you may not know how quickly things might progress if it does from there. But moving while not being able to process all the information like you used to can even be harder than a physical type of impairment. So with cognitive impairments, that's one that I say do as quickly as you can. And when you are higher functioning, you have the ability to adjust to a new environment much better than if you wait until the confusion level is quite high. So here's where we're going to end. Just a couple more pieces of advice here. That my feeling is that if you're really feeling lonely, this is the time to think about moving. The socialization piece, there's so much research around that can be tied to longevity. And a quick summary of a webinar I went to about 10 years ago, that was a retired dean from the School of Social Work, University of Washington, had said that in research she conducted, lack of socialization paired with stressors in your life can be the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And I will never forget that statistic. That's amazing to me. So that we are social people by nature doesn't mean we're the center of attention and social butterflies all the time. But those conversations, those connections are important for our life, our health. If it feels like it's time to look at handing over some caregiving responsibilities when part of a couple, it's time to make the move and go ahead and share in those responsibilities. If you need help with activities of daily living, but you feel like having that person come into your house where it feels like they're kind of invading your personal space a lot, if it feels like that and that you'd like an environment with more privacy, that would be what a retirement community can do for you. You have your private apartment, and then the caregivers come as needed, and then they leave, and then you're left with the privacy of your own home. If you have a diagnosis that says you are really likely to need care in the future, do it sooner rather than later. The more care needs that are in place before moving in makes it harder, and it narrows down your options. Don't forget about that admission criteria that we talked about before. If you're just someone who is more anxious by nature and you're worried about the what ifs, what happens if I fall and I can't reach my son, or it snows too much, whatever it might be, keep in mind, peace of mind of moving into a retirement community where you have people accessible 24/7 could possibly be the answer there. And then a couple other questions to ask yourself, or maybe to talk about with family, would be, if you do have a plan in place, even if you're not moving tomorrow, but you have a plan mapped out, that you've done your own decision making and you've picked out what communities are your first choice and second choice and have shared that with family, imagine what that peace of mind could look like. And would they view that as a gift if you do that for them? So that is the end of me rambling on incredibly long here at over an hour and 11 minutes, but it takes some time to get through this. I'm going to stop sharing the screen here for a moment, and then I'm going to see if there are questions here in the chat. I will also invite you at this time, if you do have questions that you would prefer to just ask over the mic instead of looking in the chat feature, that you're able to do that. You can unmute your mics and just shout out a question. While you're working on that, I will just read this one chat question. Will you make your slides available to us afterwards? I promise to do that, yes. We'll actually be emailing out a feedback form, and while that email is being sent out, we can send the slides to you at that time. That's a very good question. Thank you. Okay, if anybody is still awake after listening to me ramble, is there anybody that would like to ask a question via chat or by taking their mic off? Mute.
Can you see us?
Yes. Hi, yes.
I've listened to your speech and I think it was great. There's a lot of things I would question and want to know about. And it seems to me that the best way to do this would be to sit down with someone like you, explain my situation and have you help me.
Yes, I think ideally that is the perfect thing to do because everybody's situation is different. And you know, we scratched the surface here on the different types of models that are out there. When learning more about one's preferences, health conditions, any other challenges that they might be experiencing, or just knowing what's really important to them, that can help anybody who's in a role like mine, help guide them into the right community. And know, for anybody who's on the call here, I'm happy to do that whether you're interested in the gardens at Town Square or not. This is a passion of mine to help people find the right fit for them. So I'm happy to do that, most definitely. So is your name, is it Jacqueline? I'm looking at how it reads on the screen.
And how do you get to you? Through a email or telephone or what?
Yeah, good question. I will ask you, Jacqueline, did you receive an email from Levy Men? He's part of the team here. Okay, so then I know we have your contact information. And when you RSVP'd, if you RSVP'd with your current name, Jacqueline, I'll know how to find you. I'm just going to make a little note while we're talking, so I will follow up with you. Thank you for mentioning that. Okay. Beverly, I see you're off mute. Did you have a question for me?
Yes, I've already signed up over there. I'm in a waiting list. That's not, and I would like, my financial people would like a new brochure sent to me with all the current information.
All right, Beverly, I'll follow up with you in the next coming days and we'll figure out how to get that information.
Okay.
I have it handy. I'll just connect with you offline so that I know how to get it to the right people.
Now, because of COVID, you don't have any visitations over there. Activity.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'll talk about two different points on that. So the answer is yes and no. So at the very beginning of COVID, all retirement communities were shut down pretty tight at that time. No activities, no meals. They would ask residents to stay in apartments. That lightened up over time. Then when vaccinations came in, restrictions lifted quite a bit more, leaving visitors still not able to come in, but the residents could do really whatever they wanted in the community. There's been a change recently in the past couple of weeks because I'm sure all of you have heard a little bit about the Omicron variant that's out there. So interestingly, the vaccinations have been doing an amazing job where if somebody does become exposed to it, it feels, from my perspective, talking to many retirement communities, that it's having minimal impact in terms of the health of their residents or staff, very minimal. That's the good news. But there are still restrictions that public health officials will issue if positive cases are detected. And I can even speak to the gardens at Town Square specifically, where we had only 2 residents. I felt we came up pretty good with all the holidays and all the exposure. Just 2 residents showed up as positive. One didn't even have symptoms, but we tested her because a family member called us. And some staff members who, of course, are never on site if they're positive. But even with that in place, public health officials had asked for us to wait 14 days from the last report of someone. So we're going through that right now, even though the residents are actually back to being negative with COVID. We still have certain restrictions in place. Having said that, those are restrictions where certain activities are not available, but some are. It depends on how we can social distance, but tours are still offered. As long as you're healthy, you can tour, you pass our screening test, temperature reading, you're wearing a mask, we can still have visitors at this time. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm sure that's on everybody's mind. In fact, there is a question, are all Town Square employees vaccinated? That's a really good question. So 100% of the residents are. With staff members, I think it's very close to 100%, but there are some medical exceptions, very, very few. But the requirement did go into place as of October 18th of this past year. that it's not optional unless you have a documented reason. You have to become vaccinated to continue to be an employee in a healthcare setting, which does include the gardens at Town Square. And yes, the whole video will be available. We're recording it as we speak, so we'll send that out too. That won't be available today. They do some editing, but we'll send it to you in the next couple days.
Great. All right.
Okay, thank
All
you
right.
very much.
You're welcome. Now I'm realizing that it's 3:18, and if anybody is still awake after listening to me for this long, that would be impressive. I think probably what we'll do, I'll see is there any one more pressing question out there? Otherwise, I'll just follow up and get other questions that way. Anybody want to conclude with one final question? Nope, that means
Bye-bye.
you're either, okay, alrighty. We're gonna stop there then. So we're gonna end today's presentation. We'll send out the recording. We'll be in touch again soon. Thank you for joining and have a